Great. Welcome everybody to this workshop, and thank you for your interest. My name is Christine Schmidt and I'm the Deputy Director and Head of Research at the Wiener Holocaust Library. I see a lot of familiar faces, but for those of you who don't know me yet, and I'm going to introduce my, my co-speakers in just a moment. Of course, the current situation, this is something that we've just been talking about before I hit record, has prompted us to kind of rethink what our offerings and how we can adapt our offerings for online audiences. And so it's really a perfect time to dig into the digital archive of the International Tracing Service, which is now called the Arolsen Archives. And the Arolsen Archives has made a tremendous effort to put its material online. So what we'd like to do in this workshop today is highlight new work that's being done on the history of the Holocaust based on the ITS archive, which will be, I think, ably shown by Dan in his presentation, but to also give you some pointers on how you might be able to navigate the collections as they're being made available online. As many of you know, the archive has been open to researchers since 2007, and it's been accessible in different locations around the globe. But of course, the access is limited for those of you who are logging in from the United States. I know we have a few people from North America with us on this. The access point for you would be the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, but that may not be necessarily that accessible, especially not right now during the pandemic. So we've been operating it since 2013 in London at the Wiener Holocaust Library. So we hope that having this workshop now and all of us kind of exploring the archive together will provide you with some tools going forward. So before I introduce the other speakers, just a few notes of housekeeping. If you could actually mute yourself, I do hear a little bit of kind of ambient noise. If you could mute yourself for just the formal part of the discussions, that would be really helpful. And then we can open the floor for questions. And of course, you can always send questions at any time during the chat, in the chat feature at the bottom. And if you have any technical difficulties, I'll do my best to help you with Zoom. You can send me a chat directly in the chat feature. I'm assuming everybody's sort of familiar with Zoom by this point, but of course, if you're not, that's okay. Just send me a message, hit me up. So we're going to start with a presentation by Professor Dan Stone, who, in case you don't know him, is Professor of Modern History and Director of the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway, University of London. He is a historian of ideas who works primarily on 20th century European history. His research interests include the history and interpretation of the Holocaust, comparative genocide, history of anthropology, the history of fascism, cultural history of the British Right, and theory of history. He's the author or editor of 16 books and some 80 scholarly articles. We're actually currently co-editing the next volume along with Suzanne Barjett at the Imperial War Museum of the Beyond Camps and Forced Labor conference together. And his latest research on the ITS will be published in a monograph next year entitled Fate Unknown. So this presentation, I think, is going to highlight some of the most fascinating aspects, I think, of his research on the Death March investigations conducted by the ITS. It's also formed some of the basis of an exhibition that we co-curated a few years ago at the library, in which we're turning into a traveling exhibition this year. And following from Dan, I'll be giving a sort of a brief discussion of some of the Death March documents in the online archive. And then I'd like to introduce my two colleagues, Elise and Mary Vrabecz, who are both senior ITS archive researchers at the Wiener Holocaust Library. And they've been with us for several years and have developed expertise and tremendous skill in navigating and interpreting the archive with tremendous knowledge and, of course, extensive empathy and sensitivity because their primary focus is working with family researchers. But of course, they're quite handy with scholarly researchers as well. So you'll be in really good hands with them after Dan's presentation. So without further ado, I will hand over now the screen to Dan so he can take us through some of his research on the death marches.
Thanks, Christine, and welcome everybody. It's nice to see everybody here. I'm going to share my screen in a moment. What I want to do is to talk about the the forced evacuations or death marches, and then to talk a little bit about the program that the fledgling ITS, then the UNRWA Central Tracing Bureau, undertook in the immediate aftermath of the war to retrace the steps of the death marches, and where the Allies were exhuming bodies in cases where mass graves were discovered, where ITS was trying to identify the victims. With little success, but in rather interesting ways, I think. I have a presentation, and the presentation mostly comprises images, and so I want, of course, to set them in some context and explain that although the images that you can find in ITS, particularly the death march maps, the cemetery maps and so on, are visually very striking and extraordinary to look at, they only really make sense, of course, when combined with other documentation. And so I'm going to keep doing this because I've got another laptop open on the side of me with my various bits of text open that I want to read to you. So I don't have some kind of strange twitch. I'm just trying to combine various screens at the moment. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see the presentation. Okay, I hope you can all see that. Come on. Right. Anyway. That's better. There's just a little quotation to kick us off. I think explains a great deal about what the ITS, if you like, the moral motivation for much of what the ITS did is kind of set out there quite nicely by Telford Taylor. As you know, the ITS archive, the digital archive, comprises over 30 million documents. That's a lot of stuff, and even if you've been working on it for the last 5 years, as I have, you of course cannot read everything, and there's much more in ITS than we're going to talk about today. I'm not going to talk about the concentration camp records, about the IRO records, the DP camps, the child search branch, and many other aspects of ITS, though I'm of course happy to take questions. I'm also, as you'll see in my presentations, this one, for example, the first one, each of the images has the reference number to ITS, in this case 6.1.1, and then the document. That's the first part of the reference is the subunit of the digital archive, where you can find the document, and then the specific document ID number. I'm not going to comment any more about that now because Christine, I think, is going to say something about the differences between the digital archive and what's available online and navigating them both. And I think Elise and Mary will also have something to say about the online access to these documents as well. So I just want to talk you through specifically what UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, which was the body in charge of the initial tracing bureau that was set up in 1944-45, was doing with respect to tracing the missing, and particularly with respect to death marches. So here you can see this is an example of what ITS called mass tracing. That's to say, apart from trying to find individuals by looking through document records or searching in the field, the Tracing Bureau would also issue over the radio or sometimes broadcast in cinemas and in the press appeals for help. And this one comes from 1946. And here you can see where the title of today's session comes from. It is to assist the gigantic task of establishing the fate of all those persons whose names are now listed amongst the legion of the lost. The UNRWA Central Tracing Bureau is asking for the help of every generous-hearted person who is in a position to assist. I think you can see that the ITS there, I'm going to use ITS anachronistically for all the various incarnations of the Tracing Bureau, so just ignore it. But you can see that in some ways mass tracing was regarded by ITS as a method of last resort. It was when they had no documents, they couldn't find anything else out, they would sometimes put out these sorts of appeals. But what I want to talk about now is something that was of much more immediate appeal, and something for which the ITS had great hopes, because they did have documents. They had records from many of the concentration camps within the borders of the Third Reich, captured at the end of the war. And that's to say what happened to concentration camp inmates during the death marches. So in the autumn of 1945, the ITS took the decision to send field workers out to retrace the steps of the death marches, to find out where inmates had died or had been shot en route, to find out where they'd been buried, and if possible, to identify them. Obviously, you can imagine that this process of discovery was very far from simple, and it required immense logistical skill, the careful use of scarce resources, powers of persuasion and negotiation with locals, and fortitude in the face of very unpleasant realities. Although the new post-Nazi Bürgermeister, the mayors of localities across Germany, had been instructed by the occupation authorities to provide lists of non-Germans who had been killed in their localities, and many of them complied, that didn't mean that they could be identified. ITS didn't have the power to exhume graves. It could only follow where the military authorities had already permitted the exhumation of bodies, but it slipstreamed, if you like, and attended these exhumations in order to try and negotiate with the various authorities involved to gain access to the bodies, to try and do what they could to identify them. And I'll come back a bit later to show some different ways in which they tried to do that. So first, I want to talk about the actual maps you can find in ITS. These are in various locations in ITS, and there's a 3-volume set called Death Marches, Route de la Mort, which is in at least 2 separate locations in the digital archive. I think Christine wants to talk a little bit about that. And I start with this one, Flossenburg to Cham, through the Upper Palatinate of Bavaria, near the Czech border, a death march that took place in April 1945, because this was the first one that the ITS investigated in detail, and the records in ITS relating to this specific death march investigation are very thorough. First of all, I mean, you can see quite clearly the detail that they went into on the map. The maps are not always to scale, but they certainly show many of the small places through which the inmates marched. They give an impression of what we know now, which is that the death marches constituted a kind of mobile concentration camp, that this notion after the war that the Germans didn't know about concentration camps, it was always nonsense, given how many there were, when we include sub-camps and camps run by local councils and firms and so on. But the death marches brought the concentration camps to just about every place in Germany, and you can see that very clearly on the maps. The maps are not to scale, but these maps are usually accompanied also by tables which set out the distances between each place and give a total of the total distance walked by the inmates. So if you look at this particular map, obviously the detail is considerable, but you have to supplement it, as I say, with other material. So first of all, there's a Belgian report on this march, which shows how many inmates died at each way station and whether it was possible to identify them. So for example, they refer to one place called Burg-Laadsried, which is actually a mistake. The village is actually called Burghardried. And there are lots of little spelling mistakes like that on the maps, but that doesn't matter. But the point is they mentioned that at Burg-Laadsried, victims of the SS were found buried in the cemetery. They number 5 people. There were no identification marks. In other places, they found just 1 person, and sometimes they found more than 100. And in the vast majority, no identification was possible, even when numbers were recorded. That's because numbers in concentration camps were sometimes switched. Sometimes the sequence was stopped and restarted. Sometimes numbers from different camps overlapped, and it wasn't possible to identify which camp a person came from, and various other reasons. But even where identification couldn't be made, there was also other significant information that emerged. So for example, in Grabenstadt, the report says Total of 17 dead, 6 to 7 between Grabenstadt and Lohme on road number 14. According to information given by the population, 12,000 persons are said to have passed through the town. Witnesses state that some of the victims were killed because they were begging for a piece of bread. There are no crosses or identification marks on the graves. The Bürgermeister and priest have again assumed their work, and the military government of Vohenstrauss, as well as the Landrat of Vohenstrauss, have been advised in regard to the above. Although the Germans say that they did not know what was happening in the concentration camps, the Bürgermeister of Grabenstadt certified that the population knew that there was smoke coming day and night from the chimney of the crematory and that horrible things were happening there. So the documents that accompany these reports, that accompany the maps, are also, I think, really important to make sense of what you're looking at. And in this particular case, one of the officials involved, a guy called McTavish, wrote a long report which set out the sort of overview of the research into this particular example, and he talks a lot about the fact that already so soon after the war, the locals want to forget, nobody wants to admit to anything, and how important it is for the ITS to be conducting its research. But I wanted to just read the concluding paragraph to his report, because a lot of the time in the ITS documents, it's very technical, or there's a very repetitive and brutal commentary on death, and you know, this number of people died here, that number of people died there. It's easy to forget what you're actually reading, and this is something that struck McTavish already in 1946 when he wrote this report. He says, in conclusion, we would like to add that this Death March report is at first glance not impressive or as dramatic as one might expect. It takes a second reading or a study of the sworn statements accompanying the report to feel the impact and significance of statements such as 17 persons were shot that night and are buried near the highway, or 140 persons were buried near the village, but no attempt was made to identify them. It is beyond imagination to picture the actual march of starving, ill human beings through woods and villages, herded into groups and shot, propelled by vicious guards from town to town, only to be exterminated piecemeal as the fancy or opportunity arose. So I think you have a good sense there of something that's not always clear from the maps themselves, which is the ethical imperative driving much of what the ITS chose to do in the early post-war period. And don't forget that undertaking this work in 1945-46 was no mean feat. I mean, they had to kind of beg for petrol, even things like paper and pens. Basic resources were a real struggle for the ITS to get hold of. So to actually conduct this research was really, I think, quite remarkable in many ways. I'm going to show you just a couple of other examples, which I think are quite interesting for various reasons. This one you can see is from Nordhausen, which was one of the main subcamps of the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp system in the Harz Mountains, across the Harz Mountains to Hamburg, and then to Belsen. I just need to scroll down over here to the relevant bit I want to report to you. Dora, as you probably know, was a camp that became an autonomous camp late in the war, and was where underground factories were set up for the construction of the V2 rockets. Many of the inmates were evacuated in April 1945, and those from Nordhausen in particular were evacuated after the RAF bombarded the camp on the 3rd and 4th of April. There were about 36,000 inmates, and 20,000 of them were marched across the Harz Mountains in the direction of Belsen. I say in the direction of Belsen. I mean, you can see on the map how far that is. They were being expected to walk. The Death March report accompanying this simply says, many dead PP were left along the railway. PP means political prisoners, i.e. Concentration camp inmates. And that from Hamburg, the means of transportation to Belsen was unknown. So again, we have sort of information. We have a map, in this case not very detailed, You can find in the records accompanying the maps some information, but really not a huge amount in this particular case. You have to look elsewhere outside of ITS. That's something else that we can talk about. This one, Buchenwald to Belsen, is another good example. Let me just find the relevant section here. Yeah, okay, I included this one because I think obviously the liberation at Belsen is probably the most famous case of the liberation of the camps. And here you see another example of inmates being forced to march huge distances in order to reach Belsen. And of course, the inmates, as they were leaving, didn't really know very much about it. So at first they were sent, many of them were sent by train as far as Cela, so most of the way towards Belsen, and then they walked the final 20 kilometers to the camp, arriving there on the 12th of April, so 8 days after setting out from Buchenwald, at the point at which the camp was at the height of its disastrousness, as you know. And you have to find, again, I think, documentation to bring to life what the map means. So to give you an example, one inmate who testified after the war and whose testimonial is in ITS, a man called Arnold Basch, was sent in February 1945 to Hanover-Linden, a subcamp of Neuengamme, where he worked in the Hanomag factory. When that was destroyed in an air raid at the end of March, he was sent with 500 other inmates to Belsen. Having been in numerous camps, they recognized the smell, he says. It was the smell of corpses, which we knew well from Auschwitz. What they didn't recognize was the way they entered the camp. So when they arrived at Belsen, in this late point in the war, there was no formal registration, and they were simply flung into a barracks full of corpses, many of them in the camp. And so again, I won't belabor the point here because I think many of you are familiar with the documents relating to what Belsen was like in its final days. But here I think you get an understanding from some of these maps about the fact, well, about why, for example, what became known as Camp 2 was being used, where tens of thousands of inmates from other camps were placed in the very final days of Belsen's existence. You get a good sense of where the inmates came from and how they arrived at Belsen. This one I've included. This is from a French report, as you can see, and I've included this one because it includes the Beloer Wald, the Beloer forest, which you can see marked on the map there as Bois de Below in French. This is where one of the most famous massacres took place during the death marches. So again, the map itself is interesting. There's a lot to learn from it, but to make sense of it, we also need other documents. So in this case, for example, I'm talking primarily about the inmates of Sachsenhausen now, who were marched out on 21st of April 1945 in the direction of Schwerin. The majority of them, about 16,000, were forced to stop on the way in the Below forest near Wittstock, which you can see in the middle of the map there, on the 23rd of April. They spent there 6 nights in the open, fenced in by barbed wire, whilst their guards stayed in a nearby shepherd's house, and the commandant, Anton Keindl, the commandant of Sachsenhausen, enjoyed a few days' rest in Wittstock. One of the inmates says they were, quote, abandoned to their terrible fate for days, without any food, without water, without medical help. Or as one former inmate put it, in the woods, we lived like apes for 4 days in the rain on the bare earth. During this period, the scenes that took place in the Below forest were truly shocking, even for the camp-hardened evacuees. So Max Geisler, a former inmate doctor, describes how the SS mocked the starving inmates, promising them that bread and warm rolls would be distributed, which of course never happened. He recounts cases of suspected cannibalism and tells of a young Russian who died in his arms with the words, 3 little potatoes in 7 days on his lips. when the Red Cross trucks arrived, which is one of the characteristics of this particular event, you can understand why Geisler says that it seemed as though everyone had suddenly gone crazy. In all the years of horror and ongoing shock, he says, nothing was comparable to the impression made on the despairing and half-starved masses in the Below forest by the appearance of the 14 white trucks of the Swiss International Red Cross. Even today, I can't grasp how so many of those lying on the ground found the strength to get up and drag themselves to the distribution point for the packets. So here, it's one thing to look at these maps. You need, as I say, to look elsewhere to really understand what they mean. Okay, there are many of those death march routes in ITS, and I think Christine and Elise and Mary will talk a bit more about them. What I want to do is to move on now a few years from the death march routes and think a little bit about a related but different operation that the ITS called at first Graves Recheck, and then in 1949 they renamed Identification of the Unknown Dead. That's to say precisely trying to identify who the corpses were that were exhumed in various locations across Germany. And the first example comes from Dachau in 1949. There had already been various exhumations taking place in Dachau immediately after the war, but this particular mass grave was discovered in 1949 when some digging was taking place by a local company. And the interest in this case is that the experts, so-called, from Munich, who were called in to look at the bodies that were discovered in 1949, concluded that the bones were more than 10 years old and were probably a century old, and therefore couldn't have been the remains of concentration camp victims. I think everybody outside of the German authorities knew that this was nonsense, and had to then they had to follow an investigation to disprove it. So a new committee of medical experts was established. The committee that was set up were sent more bone samples as well as soil from the area. They sent the same stuff to the US Army Institute of Pathology in Washington, DC, as well as again to the University of Munich. The ITS field workers then began investigating the mass graves, where they also found the bones of children as well as adults. That finding, i.e. the discovery of children, as well as the fact that some of the skeletons appeared to have been shot with bullets manufactured in the mid-1930s, suggested that the bodies were indeed from the concentration camp. As one of the ITS workers wrote in a report, all this talk about Napoleon, etc., is nonsense. And the different states of decay of the bodies in the various locations could be explained by the fact that the bodies were in the sand, i.e. they were in shallow graves, and therefore the bodies had decayed at different rates. I'll give you another example. This one is quite an interesting one in terms of what's available in ITS. At the opposite end of Germany, near Bremen, in the Neuenkirchen shipyard. This is where there's a subcamp of Neuengamme called Bremen Fage, which was a submarine U-boat building construction site. So basically the submarine pens there on the banks of the river, leading out to the open sea, and the slave laborers from the subcamp were required to work in the submarine pens. It's now a large memorial site, Gedenkstätte, and this book by Mark Bugelen is a brilliant guide to the site itself, called the Bunker Valentin. That was its code name. So again, the corpses were discovered in shallow sand in 1949, and it was in this instance there was no debate about the fact that they were clearly concentration camp victims, but there was still a kind of obfuscation about what how to describe the bodies, if you like. So you can see there in this photograph the sort of bleak landscape in which this discovery was made, and the process of digging the bodies that took place. Here, one of the investigating lawyer confirmed the fact that the corpses were from the concentration camp, but then said, "It cannot yet be said whether they died an unnatural death." This, I think, was a kind of typical post-war German form of exculpation. That's to say, it seemed to make a difference to the lawyer whether the people died from being worked to death of exhaustion or whether they were shot through the head. Either way, it's perfectly clear to us today that they were victims of slave labor at the camp. This language of having died a natural or unnatural death is rather obfuscatory, I think. So the photographs that accompany the exhumations are the reason that I wanted to show this one, because I think they're rather striking, and they also accompany various statements from the police, the workers who found the bones, and the forensic experts. And I think this one's particularly noteworthy. So you can see two men in German police uniform, one of whom is smiling rather incongruously at the camera. They're placed centrally in the frame, surrounded by civilians, and strikingly at the front, another photographer who's taking a close-up shot of the digging, although we can't see in this photograph anyway what he's looking at. The conditions, I guess the black and white photo contributes to this, but you can see the conditions of the landscape gives us a good sense of the bleak working conditions in the subcamp. So whilst there's quite a large number of people in the frame, the landscape itself looks pretty unforgiving. It's hard to know, I think, what the photographer wanted to achieve with this particular image, but the juxtaposition of the harsh landscape, which looks ideal for dumping bodies, and the smiling policeman is quite unsettling, I think, particularly when placed side by side with the more forensic photographs of exhumed skulls and other remains. So here you see the close-ups, you can see the bullet holes in the skulls of the victims buried here, and again here you can see skeletons being exhumed from the shallow soil. Particularly when one finds in the very comprehensive records relating to this case the invoice from the firm that carried out the exhumations, which offer a kind of eerie echo of slave labor invoices, of which there's also no shortage in ITS, indicating that German firms continued to make money from the murder of concentration camp inmates well after the war. In this case, the invoice is for a nice round 100 Deutschmarks, 8 Deutschmarks per corpse times 12, plus 4 Deutschmark travel costs. So you see this classic, it's often been noted, you know, the kind of accounting of the Holocaust, and you see this continues after the war as well. This is very, where firms in 1943-44 were sending invoices to the SS for a certain number of hours worked per Jew. Now they were sending invoices in for digging up corpses. Okay, in these two more examples of bits of information that I wanted to bring to your attention was the fact that in many cases the ITS couldn't identify bodies, but they did find scraps of paper and information and possessions. And these are also to be found in the digital archive. This particular case, Neunburg vorm Wald, is also in the Upper Palatinate in Bavaria, and is on the Flossenburg death march that I started with. And although these bits of paper that were found couldn't be used to identify the bodies, they're nevertheless, in some cases where they're readable, rather moving. And this case is, I think, a particularly good example. Yeah, you can read the text yourselves there. So there's not very many examples like that in ITS, but there are some. And of course, as you know, the Arolsen Archives today still has in its possession a number of items belonging to former camp inmates, particularly from Neuengamme, watches, earrings, and so on, and have been making an effort in the last few years to try and return them to the descendants of those victims. Just one final case, and then I'll stop. This is an example of a death march, of a mass grave where the bodies were dug up and then reburied with full military honours, as sometimes happened. And you can trace the steps whereby the military authorities and ITS tried to identify the bodies and then went through the process of creating cemeteries for them and reburying them and trying to provide lists of names. So Schürzingen is in Württemberg, where there was nearby a subcamp of Natzweiler in Alsace, which was, and in this particular case, was one of the so-called Wüste camps, or the desert camps, which was a group of subcamps set up late in the war in order to try and provide shale oil for the German war effort. Kind of failed, but nevertheless was a project that the Nazis took on late in the war. There's the grave when it was first discovered. And here you can see later is the so-called Ehrenhalle, the hall of honor built at Schürzingen. The French occupation authorities, in this case, exhumed the bodies of about 540 corpses immediately after the end of the war. And the French officer who wrote the report gave orders to the mayor of Schürzingen that the bodies which had been left pell-mell should be exhumed as soon as possible and given graves appropriate to the cause for which they died, without specifying what that corpse was. When the excavations took place, the decomposed state of the bodies meant that identification was impossible. The majority of the corpses were found to have died from malnourishment, but about 40% of them had been killed by hanging and some by shooting. All of them had been buried naked, and in some cases it was suspected that they'd been buried alive. Over the years, there's been further investigation into this case, and there is now a book containing the names of 529 of the camp's victims, a memorial book, and you can see here that some of the names on the wall of the hall, and you can see that the French authorities then decided to build a proper cemetery on the site of the former concentration camp, and in ITS you find the architectural plans and a photograph of the Ehrenfriedhof, the cemetery of honor that was there. I think I've gone on for already over half an hour, yes? Just about. So I will stop there. I mean, I just wanted to provide you with those examples, just to give a very brief overview of the sort of thing that you can find in the Death March and Graves Recheck collections. There's loads more to be discovered, and I'm happy to take questions and to talk more if there's time today or next week. But I'll hand over now to Christine, who I think is going to go next and talk about the actual process of finding this stuff online. Okay, so thank you.
Thanks for that, Dan. I think we will have time for questions, hopefully after I, Elise, and Mary chat a bit more about how to find this stuff in the archive. But I think it's been, it's a tremendous amount of work that you've done in navigating the material, and I think this particular piece of your work shows not only the breadth of the types of material that's in the archive, but also the remarkable efforts of the ITS after the war, which I think we've done a lot of work on this. But I think it's just the amount of efforts and that were put into these investigations, as you pointed out at the beginning, with such very little resource and the logistical difficulties involved in doing that. So thank you for that. I think it was a great introduction to, and more than an introduction really, to the material in the archive. So I think before we break for questions, I think we'll keep going, and then at the end we will have some time. And of course, if you have any at any point, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we can, I'll sort of sort through them at some point and feed them back to the speakers as necessary. So turning back to the archive itself, about 95% of the material that the ITS holds, these 30 million documents that Dan referred to, have been digitized, and that's been going on for a couple of decades. And as I mentioned before, it's only been accessible to outside researchers since 2007 at various copy holding institutions around the world, the Holocaust Museum in Washington and, for example, Yad Vashem in Israel. And the library has had its access since 2013, and we've been prioritizing research assistance to survivors and families and descendants of survivors, but of course also supporting academic research, as Dan's presentation so ably shows. And over the last few years, the Arolsen Archives has made a significant effort to put more of this material online. And this has been done in partnership largely with Yad Vashem. And I think, you know, we can also see that their efforts are outstanding. And they've just within the last week have published their annual report. So I encourage everyone to have a look at their website, which I'm going to talk about and show you in a second. So what I'd like to do is just walk through some of the starting points for some of the material that Dan has used in his work and how you can start navigating the collection specifically for the Death March material. And then I'll hand over to Elise, who will carry out some examples of searches, maybe on other topics as well, maybe searching for some individuals. And then Mary is going to discuss some of the tools that are available online that have been developed by the Arolsen Archives and their partners. And then next week, after you've had kind of a week to digest and explore the archive on your own, we're going to ask everyone to come back for part 2, which we won't record, and to discuss, to find a document or a set of documents that is useful for your current research or your work, and to present it briefly in relation to your research project or your work. And also any questions you might have about it, or questions about technical questions in terms of accessing the archive or anything. And then we'll also, at the end of this, discuss how we might, what we'd like to do is kind of break everyone into groups and assign you to either to me, to Elise, or Mary, and we can help you throughout the week if you have any questions via email. So I think with that, with that praise and that, the immense work that Arolsen Archives has undertaken in putting this tremendous amount of material, which is, as you can see from Dan's presentation, ranges from photographs to name lists to maps to all sorts of different types of handwritten and typeface documentation online. The search functions are constantly being upgraded. So the search is only, I think, as strong as the indexing and the cataloging, which is, again, constantly being improved. You might have seen they've just launched a campaign called Every Name Counts, which is working to index all of the names in the collection. And this is a crowdsourced effort. So some things are a bit easier, I think, still to access when you go on site. We have, for example, access to the Central Names Index, which has a partial index of all of the 17.5 million names, which you can't actually access online. But I'm going to leave that part of searching for individual names to Elise. And at this point, I would like to share my screen. So hopefully this works. Take you right to the archive. Hopefully everybody can see that. So the website for the Arolsen Archives, if you've never been to it, is arolsenarchives.org. And to go specifically to searching, you can, let's see. You just click here. See if my system actually likes this. Okay, so if you click on search and explore, you're going to find where you click on you scroll down through the page to the online archive, and you click over to the online archive. And here you're going to see a few options. This is essentially the interface for searching the collection online. And what I think is kind of immediately interesting for our purposes in the discussion that we started off with Dan's research is the kind of the pilot website that they started a few years ago, where they started to put collections online, specifically starting with the death marches, where they've plotted the information on a map. So what I did was I came over here to this right-hand side of the screen and just clicked go to maps. I'm going to click over here. I'm working on a very small screen, which is why it's a little bit awkward for me, so apologies. I'm working on an 11-inch screen, which is, kind of doing my head in. But in any case, this is something that the Arolsen Archives started with when they started to publish discrete collections online. And this is some of the material that Dan was referring to. So if you saw in his citations, a lot of times when he was showing the PowerPoint presentation, these numbers, and if you ever hear anyone who's working on the ITS talk speak in this kind of strange number speak of 1.1 point whatever or 5 point whatever, this is ITS speak for subunits, and this is how the collection has been organized. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But essentially, you can see the kind of the archival tree here on the left, and then the Death March section. This specific pilot where this is kind of an older defunct site that they aren't actually updating anymore. But this older pilot site has specifically presented information and extricated names via geoindex, via mapping about the death marches, which is subunit 5.3. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that. I just wanted to highlight this section in particular because it can be navigated via the map, via the geo names, which might be particularly interesting for one of our participants, Dan DeLeaf, who I know at Clark is working a bit on mapping and GIS. So maybe this is something that's particularly interesting to him. But this Death March material, which Dan highlighted, is also accessible through the newer website, which is back here. I'm going to go back to my previous tab here, which is where you can search either for people or topics. Now, there are some filters that you can start to put onto the material, but I'm just going to go quickly here to Browse Archive, which is where you see the similar kind of, let me close this, sorry, where you see the same archival structure here is replicated here. But what they've done in the new collection is they've tried to describe the folder level of the material a bit better and with more specificity. So where you see on the older site, sorry, this is really, in the older site here, where you see section subunit 5 is labeled miscellaneous. In the new section, they've actually titled it with what is in the collection, which is the Death March material and identification of unknown dead, which is the information that Dan ended his presentation with, and Nazi trials. And so you can navigate through this material by clicking on the plus sign, and it can take you right to 5.3, which is where all the most of the Death March material is. Now, it's not only located here, but this is where, if you wanting to start your search on death marches, I would recommend coming right to 5.3. And when you click further, you'll see these sort of yellow highlights, and this tells you that the material is online. And once you click through here, there's a lot of real estate that's taken up by the metadata here, but if you scroll down below, you'll get to the images, and you can double click on these and it'll open it full screen. Now, one of the difficulties, I think, in trying to look for information based on, for example, existing citations that Dan was referring to in his presentation, is that again, the material is only as good as the indexing. The search is only as good as the indexing. So if you were to, for example, search for reports by the International Information Office in Dachau, or the UNRWA Central Tracing Bureau's report on the death marches, that's a bit difficult because if you put in a search term, it doesn't automatically come up. So you really have to kind of navigate through to the archive using other types of metadata to find the information. So Another kind of way through to this is looking at the topics. So there's this topic filter. So if you open that, there's actually a subject index. And if you open this section, you'll see a variety of different terms where they started to collate information based on index terms that you can search. So for our purposes, I'm just going to click on death marches. And what you see here, this 124, that doesn't mean 124 pages, that means 124 folders where the information is located. And within each folder, there's hundreds to thousands of pages of documentation. So if I click apply, what's going to happen is it's starting to collate information from across different subunits. So you'll see the signature here on the left is 1.107, which comes from the incarceration subunit, specifically the Auschwitz subunit. And then if we scroll down just to see what other sorts of information are pulled up by this type of facet searching, you'll start to see that we get down into 5.3. So this is one way to kind of navigate the material and to kind of collate the material according to a specific type of thematic search. And again, this is always being improved with increased indexing efforts on the part of Arolsen and improved catalog descriptions. So for example, if I just click here, you can see the description is quite specific about the identification of prisoners in Diebersried and Pösing on a death march from Flossenburg. This can also again be searched through the search terms, through the search brackets on this landing page. I think before I steal too much of Elise's thunder, I think I'm going to pass over to her. But I kind of want to just take that time to show in the archive essentially where information on the death marches is primarily located, but to note that it is also found in other sections. And the way you get to those sections is, it depends on the sorts of things you're looking for. So if we don't cover the topic that you're specifically looking for in our presentations, please give us a shout at the end when we open for questions and answers, and we can help navigate through to those areas. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to hand over to Elise so she can pick up and take us through some searches.
Hello everyone, I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for that introduction, Christine. I'm going to start, I'm going to talk basically a bit more about how you actually start using the online archive. If you have no experience of using it, it is quite a daunting proposition. We've heard about all these 30 million documents in the Arolsen Archives, in the ITS archive. The first thing to note is that not all of that material is in the online archive, as Christine has said. You're talking about 26 million documents are available through the online archive. So that's still obviously a huge amount of material. Forgive me as well, I'm doing the same as Dan, as in I'm looking here and reading from here, so forgive the head switches. What I've done as well is I've made a PowerPoint presentation that I'm not actually going to share with you now, because I think it'd be better if I share my screen and show myself working through the archive, but I'll circulate the PowerPoint presentation afterwards. That'll have a lot of the material, a lot of the links that I've been talking about. I'm going to share my screen now, hopefully. Okay, can you all see that? Hopefully, good. So this is where we will begin our search. So say you're looking for your own research, you're looking for your own topic, you come to this home screen, this area here. As you can see, the left-hand side of the screen shows you the way to, this is how you search, and then the right-hand side of the screen shows you the results of your search. That's sort of a basic way to divide it up. There are two main ways to navigate to the information available, via the search function and via browsing the archive. I know that Christine's mentioned these already, but I think it's probably just worth going through it in quite basic detail, just in case you haven't seen this at all before. The search function is, it's fairly sort of, I wouldn't say, it's not a rudimentary search function, but as Christine says, it depends very much on the level of indexing that's already gone into it. And Arolsen Archives are doing massive amount of work to improve this and to improve the search capabilities of the material that's available. First of all, let's try a name search. So say you are looking for a person and you have a rough idea of their surname. Now the good news is that you don't have to worry too much about the exact spelling of a person's name because the names are organized phonetically, alphabetically. So as long as you have this box here, includes synonyms, keep that ticked. As long as you've got that ticked, you're probably going to be fine. So say, for example, you're searching for, one second, make sure I get my spelling right. Say you're looking for a Joseph Rubinstein. Click on the search. And you can see here, we've got 68 records. But look at the moment as well, you've got various spellings of Joseph, you've got various spellings of Rubinstein. So that's not something to worry about too much. To be honest, even if you know the exact spelling of a person's name, I'd still advise to include this synonym search because you don't know if the name was misspelled in the original document. Like you might know for a fact the person you're looking for spelt their surname this way. That doesn't mean it was spelt that way in the document. Now, once you've run your name search, you can filter any results by religion, nationality, and family status. But as Christine said, that depends on that information already having been entered. So of these 68 records, apparently only 4 of the people there are Jewish. I don't think that's necessarily the case. So I'm saying, use that, but use it with discretion, I would say. 1 second. And then if we search, for example, on, I'm thinking as well about women's names. For Miriam Cohen. One of the excellent things about the search is that you don't need to worry about maiden names or married names. It brings up both of those, as you can see here. It is also good for taking into account female suffixes. So, for example, in Czech and other Slovak languages, when female surnames have over at the end, you don't need to worry about that. It's bringing both up. So once you search for your person, I'll just go back to the search that has slightly more results. Go back to Miriam. And obviously, as you would expect, you can organize by date of birth, place of birth. So say you're interested in the people of Berlin, then you sort of click onto the archive. It's fairly sort of self-explanatory, this part. And when you scroll down, this is where you access the material itself. Now, as Christine said, the metadata is up on the top of the top right-hand side, which is very useful, very interesting, and the documents themselves are here. Now, say you're not looking for an individual person. I'm going to come back to talking about saving documents later, but you're looking for a more general topic. So you can type in something as general as Buchenwald, for example, and this brings back over 250,000 documents related to named individuals. Sorry, the search is still running. There we go. Over 250,000 records related to named individuals and over 900 documents that are more from the general administrative information. So this is things like correspondence, post-war testimonies, things like that. You can search for broader terms as well. A search, for example, for medical experiments will bring up a few results. It's bringing up 90 results, but you can sort of combine that with surnames of people who were victims or people that carried out the experiments, for example. One thing though, if Buchenwald brought back, you do have to be more careful with your spelling now. So this is not like Google, it's not going to take into account any mistakes that you make. So there I've mistyped it, and they're not letting you off the hook with that at all. You have to get some of your spellings absolutely spot on. So that's always worth being quite aware about. So once you've run your search, we'll just go back to Buchenwald. And obviously as well, I'm sure you're all very used to this, but you've got to be a bit crafty in the search terms that you use, as these are based on the indexing of the records themselves. So if you're researching, say, forced prostitution in the camps, you can search for forced prostitution. That might bring up a few results, but you should also search for words like brothel, bordello, just sort of search a bit laterally. Once you've run your search, whether this is by person or by topic, and you've clicked through to the document that you're interested in, so let's look at this one. The image will appear on the right-hand side, as Christine's already said, the various pieces of metadata here, which can be quite substantial. It can be a lot of material there that can be very useful. Sometimes there's less, sometimes it's more. It all very much depends on the level of indexing that has been done. One thing that's very important to remember, though, is that if you scroll down, if you hover here, you see how my mouse has hovered over and this number has appeared several digits long. This is the document's ID number, and that is absolutely sort of central to being able to use this document in any way afterwards. If you scroll down further, the same document number appears here. If you're going to save this document, I would strongly recommend that you use this document ID number. You can't use as part of the file name. I mean, you can save it as the woman's surname, as the date of your search, but I would strongly recommend including that document ID number and also this number here, the subunit to which it belongs, because you need both of those pieces of information to reference the document. You'll have seen that in Dan's paper. He had his referencing. Hold on.
Hey, Elise, can I just quickly interrupt you? Because I know we said we take questions at the end, but Don has asked a really good question about spelling, because you're right on that point right now about the case of German umlauts. Can you, and I know this whole website's available in German as well. Mm-hmm. Have you tried searching? Does it make a difference in terms of the spelling?
Well, we'll run a search on Müller without, so the UE brings up the umlaut. Müller without it is the same, and that's the same as well. So all three of the options will bring up all of the results. So where are we in terms of, I'm just finding a document, forgive me. So this is an example of the concentration camp records that you can see. There's a large amount of, sorry, I'm just trying to get my shared screen information out of the way. So you can click through these documents, and Mary, my colleague Mary, is going to give you some more information about how you can do contextual research into this material. But just for now, before we start talking about saving and referencing and things like that, let's go back to the alternative way to search the material in the online archive, which Christine also touched on, which is to browse the archival tree. You can see here you've got the subunits that make up the archive, and you can drill down further into them to get to the various subunits held within those, or the various folders and records held within those subunits. For example, if we open this first section here, camps and ghettos, you can see it's organized by site of incarceration. So you're interested in this one in particular, you can drill down further and keep drilling down until you come to, say, a specific document, which you can then open up and navigate through. Now, to save a document, say you decide that you want to save this one, I have not been able to find a way to save multiple documents at the same time. I've asked my colleagues, none of us have figured it out just yet, but if we do, we will let you know. But in order to save, you just right-click and save as, and as I stressed, and I realize I'm stressing this a lot, but I really would highly recommend including the document ID number, which again you can see here, and the metadata here, the 1.140. So you need the location and you need the document number. In order to, and this isn't going to be relevant for this week's task, but if you are ever coming into ITS again to use the material for publications or similar, you need to contact the Arolsen Archives for permission to publish any document. The relevant information is in the PowerPoint that I will circulate after this, and I will also circulate in the PowerPoint the necessary referencing techniques as well. Sorry, that was a bit hopscotch, but I think now I will hand over to Mary, who will be able to talk about, so say you found this document that you're interested in, how to figure out what it means, how to sort of contextualize the research.
All right, so I'm going to talk about some resources that Arolsen Archives have put together to help you as you do your research. Not necessarily just on death marches, but in all research that's related to searches that can be done through their online portal. So I am also going to share my screen. There we go. All right, so the first resource I'm going to share is an e-guide that was put together a couple of years ago by Arolsen Archives that they're slowly adding more to. They have 2 sections that are available that you can search for information on: concentration camp records and displaced persons records. So when you find an item in ITS and you're not entirely sure, given the metadata that's available on the side, exactly what that card entails, this is the place where you want to go to get some more information. So let's start by looking at concentration camp cards that you could possibly come across. So unfortunately, when you have a card that you're looking for, it just takes manually scrolling through to see if you can find a match or something similar to a card that you have. So for example, a prisoner registration card, these are really common, as you'll see as you're digging through. And the way they've set this up is, first of all, they have an initial card. They have further examples of other ways that these cards can look in the archive as well. And then, as you may have saw, when you hover over certain sections, it'll give you a translation or generally explain the kind of information that was noted in those sections. Additionally, as you scroll down, this is something they recently added, and it's more contextual information about each of these cards. How is it used? Who created it? How common they are? All of these details are really, really helpful depending on the research that you're carrying out. So it's always worthwhile to see the kind of information that's down here. There's simple cards, really in-depth cards. Again, sometimes you come across stuff quite frequently as you do your research and you know exactly what it is as soon as you see it. Other times it just takes coming over here and poking through and seeing what you can find on that card. As I mentioned previously, they also have cards about the displaced persons section of the website. So if you're searching an individual that has a CMI file or any other post-war information, this is where you would come through to look for further evidence of what is listed on these cards and how it was used. Again, it's set up exactly the same as the concentration camp records, where you get further examples, you get the contextual information down here about how it was created, where it came from, all of that. And also something that's really important, stuff to be considered, especially with the post-war documents as you read through. Sometimes the opinions of the people writing the cards comes through. Sometimes it includes evidence that hasn't been substantiated. All those kind of things that you should be aware of are listed in that section. So that, generally speaking, is the e-guide. Also, to help yourself out as you're kind of glancing through to see if you can find the type of card that you're looking for. They do kind of help try to narrow down the search by changing the format of how the cards are laid out, but that's about the only directive that you can find to help you search your way through it. And there's a lot here. It keeps going and going and going and going. So definitely take a look through this when you get to this section if you need it. The other resource I wanted to share is the DP Camp directory. And this is kind of an overview of the DP Camp system. It is in German, so the section isn't in English, but Google Translate can help you out if you need it, as you probably well know. You can search this section multiple ways. I should also say that it's just a taste of the holdings for DP camps. It's not the in-depth inventory of what is actually available. It just kind of tells you about a swimming pool, kiddie swimming pool depth of knowledge of what's there. So it just helps you kind of start to see what's available. And you can search by zone, or you can search by the name of the camp. So if you go into the zone search, you can get the simple map. You can go to whichever zone that you need. And then you can search by camp name. You can search by location. And just to give you an example of the information that's in here, it just gives you a broad overview of each of the camps about when they started, when they shut. Something that I find really helpful in here is they'll give you the area team name a lot of times, because you'll see like AT and a number on a lot of the post-war records, and you don't always know which DP camp that's referring to. So that's a good way to find this information. It also tells you in the archive what document ID numbers are covered for that DP camp. So if you go to a location that has access to the proper ITS system, you can search for that camp's records through there. The searching by camp name is very similar. You can either type in the name of a camp, you can type a location if you like, and then scroll through if you're looking for a site-specific location and see what was in that region. So that's just a broad overview of that section. Another resource that might prove helpful for you is that Christine touched on as well, actually, is there is a list of personal effects that you can see by both location and an alphabetical list of the persons at that location. So here on the left, you can see Dachau, Neuengamme, and the various other places that they have, even Gestapo items, and then you can search by person to see the type of material that's in there. You can search by location of origin of those individuals. And you just click an item and it brings up the document. So you can see what is there. And let's see, the next thing we have is that the Arolsen Archives have put together is a section on video tutorials. This might not be the most helpful at the moment, given the research that you might want to do for your presentation next week, but this would definitely be helpful for when it comes time for you to do research in person. And it's just very brief videos explaining how to do searches, thematic searches, how the archival tree works, all of that information. You can tell I was looking at this one earlier, and definitely worth coming back to when you're getting ready to use the actual archive itself. And Christine talked about the mapping tool already that is available. So I won't go back through that, but that might be helpful for some of you. So definitely it's worth poking through that area. And then the other resource that is available is there is a Gesamte Inventor that's available from ITS, and they're actually going to send us the link to that. It's just a total inventory of the ITS, obviously not super in depth, but just to help you navigate and find quickly what you're looking for. So we'll send that link, as well as the links to all of the resources that I just showed you. We'll send that after we're finished for today. And as you do your research, sorry, I'll turn off my screen share. As you do your research, just make sure that if you have any questions, you'll be sent a person who will be your contact, whether it's Elise, Christine, or myself. Feel free to ask us any questions as you go along. And yeah, we can help you with research, or if you're looking for specific archives, just let us know. All right? Thanks.
Thanks, Mary.
Yep.
Thanks, Mary and Elise, for that. We have made a really rapid run through the archives in the last 15 minutes. So now, and I've put some helpful, I've tried to keep up with Elise and Mary and put some links in the chat, which I will download afterward and send that to you, just so that you have these, the URLs as references. So now, I know we answered 1 or 2 questions during the course of the presentations, but if you have more, we very much welcome them through the chat. And I see one, well, that's just Dan saying that he's happy to answer questions as well. So feel free to either post them in the chat if you feel more comfortable that way, or unmuting yourself and asking any questions that have come to mind while we've been hammering you with lots of information. Ella.
Yes, I just wanted to ask, if you search for a name, will it pick up on anything that's been already on the incarceration units? So if there's any names listed in the incarceration units, does that pick up on the name search, or is that too?
Elise and Mary, do you want to take that one of you?
So if you run a search, do you mean sort of one of, oh sorry, and I'm not showing my screen anymore. Yes, it should bring up incarceration documents as long as they've been name indexed.
Yeah, so the names within those units have been indexed.
Like yeah, they have, to sort of,
right.
Yeah, 90% of it, is it, Christine?
Some of it, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, but no. Thank you.
If you're trying to find individual documents related to someone, so by individual documents we mean a document that only shows that person's name. So these questionnaires and things like that. If you're looking for name lists, those are still, when one person's name appears on a list of hundreds of prisoners, that will not be searchable this way.
Okay, right.
So you have to do a bit more digging to be able to find that. You have to kind of know the dates, which you can sometimes gather from individual documents, the dates of their incarceration, and then you can go back into the archive and try to look at, because like I said, the folders have been much better described in the online version than they are in the on-site version. So our folder names are really just numbered. And it's not that easy to find out what's actually in the folders until you start clicking through them. So that's a huge improvement over the system that we access every day. But it does mean that because you don't have access to the central names index, those, online, those lists are not that easily accessible.
Thank you.
So other questions? Don, I see Don's raised his hand. Hi.
Yes, hi. Thank you all for this very insightful presentations. I have 2 sets of questions. First for Professor Dan Stone. You spoke about the tracing of the routes of the death marches. And I was wondering how the UNRWA people identified these routes. Like, what sources did they use? You spoke about local witnesses, but was that all that they relied on? And you also mentioned witnesses in the local context, so Germans, but I was also wondering, did they make any use of survivors of the death marches? So that is some questions for you. And then for the archival material, I have 2 questions. I know you just wrote, Christine, that the general inventory also includes information on the non-digitized items. And I already had a question about that, but let me just pose it anyway, because I think it's relevant here. What is not digitized regarding the death marches? So we're now working with the online material, but I think for me, it would be nice to know if there's also other material pertaining to the death marches that we can only access on sites. And final question is about the quality of the documents that are available online. Are they the same size, quality as the documents on sites? Because, for example, the maps that Dan Stone showed, I think they're really helpful to have, but I was just wondering if we download them, if the quality is going to be the same as on site. Thanks.
Shall I go first?
Go for it.
That's a good question, and you'll see as soon as you start digging in the documents that they used everything all of the things that you mentioned, and everything else, everything they could find. So if you think of the situation at the end of the war with the US and British and French forces discovering camps, discovering as they occupy territory that there are dead non-Germans just about everywhere they go, evidence of massacres, evidence of people being killed on the road, and so on. They quickly established through forensic evidence, through talking to locals and talking to lots of survivors as well, that these marches have taken place. And I think it's confusing, obviously, the way it's still confusing for us to some extent, but they're able to piece together very quickly a sense of just how widespread these marches were. And with the evidence that they have, but the captured paperwork as well as talking to people, they're able then to retrace the steps quite easily, in a sense. I think it's helped by the fact that the occupation authorities issue these instructions to local Bürgermeister, where they instruct them to send in reports saying if any non-Germans have been killed in their locality and where they're buried. Most of them comply. So actually those records are also in ITS. And one of the things that I didn't show, for example, today was the cemetery maps. And there are folders full of sometimes really remarkable drawings, ranging from architectural plans through to almost cartoon-like sketches of cemeteries everywhere in Germany, showing where non-Germans are buried. And so with all of this information, they're able to retrace the routes. I think that this isn't something I've done in detail, but there are lots of errors in the routes. And so that scholars today who've done research into the death marches have discovered often that, that there's no such thing as a single route, that often groups of inmates were split into different groups and they followed slightly different paths, and then they met up again and split again, and so on and so forth. That sometimes places are listed on the maps where the death marches didn't pass through, and so on and so forth. But basically they're pretty accurate, and you'll see, I mean, some of the citations that I used in relation to those maps indicate that they spoke to a lot of survivors as well. So all of the above, basically, everything that they could get their hands on.
And back to your question on some of the archival structure, there's actually one thing that I was going to talk about when I shared my screen before. I'm glad you asked that question. It's almost as if I planted it, but I didn't, about what's available online and what's not been digitized. In terms of what's not been digitized in relation to the death marches, that I'd have to be able to consult the Gesamtinventar to be able to tell you for sure. But I think everything has been digitized. One section that isn't yet available online and also isn't available on site at any of the copy holders is, if you can see here, 5.3.4, which is cartographical material of investigations, which I think would be interesting, potentially for you to look at. We have one example of which we used in the advert for this event, and they're quite high resolution. And I think, maybe Dan can speak a bit more about this, but I don't know if you looked at these when you were on site at all, any of this from section 5.3.4. But we unfortunately don't have access to that. And I'm assuming it's because of the quality of the material, because it's quite high resolution. I don't know if Elise or Mary, you want to say a few more words about the quality of the documents in general. I don't want to just be the only mouth speaking. Quiet.
Yeah, the documents and the quality of the scans varies on when they were scanned, basically. The quality that you will get should be about the same as the quality that you would get if you came into the reading room. But as I said, the paper that was used, the paper that's used at the time was often very low quality. The scans are sometimes quite difficult to make out. But if you are having any difficulties reading a specific document, just get in touch with one of us and we'll try and see if we can switch the polarity or whatever we can do to see if we can sort of get a more a clearer version.
And generally speaking, if you're publishing something, as Elise said, you know, obviously you don't necessarily have to get the permission if you want to publish it based on, you know, taking it off the online version or taking it from one of the copy holders. But if you want a high resolution version for print, if a publisher requires that, or if you're doing an exhibition or something, then you have to go back to Arolsen, because they may have to rescan it or give you a higher resolution version. But they're really helpful with being able to provide that. So definitely recommend being in touch with them if you need it.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Alexandra. Hi.
Hi. So thank you. I guess this is something that I'm interested in, about survivors mainly. I wonder if there's any information that I could find through these documents on the expeditions or investigations, concerning what platform the reports or these maps eventually ended up on, or how the survivors could find out about the lost loved ones if they were looking for them, either in DP camps or back home. And of course, I realize that most of them were probably used for Nazi trials, but how did it go down to like a civic level? If there's information on that. And this is for, I guess, for Dan Stone, Professor Dan Stone, because I don't know if the reports contained these sorts of information.
What you have to say, Dan?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that. Do you mean how the maps were
used? Yeah. So was it like only in-house, or was it to some extent public? If yes, to what extent? I mean, is there information about it? I'm not asking factually.
I think, and the Wiener Library people might know different, but I think that this was purely in-house, and the material, certainly, I don't think that the maps and the documentation surrounding the creation of them was made available outside, because what ITS was set up for and what it did was to provide information about relatives to people making inquiries on them. And so what they were primarily interested in when they undertook this kind of research was establishing names. The same with all the documents relating, for example, to the concentration camps or to slave labor and so on, all those things that we now find so interesting for historical research. ITS wasn't interested in them from that point of view. They basically collected them and extracted names from them in order to put those names into the central database, and then so that they could be used for further research in the documentation that they had to show where people had been in the Nazi camp universe. And I think the same was true with the Death March investigations after the war. They simply wanted to gather information about where particular people had died. There may be exceptions, I don't know, but I think it was basically an in-house project.
Broadening out slightly from just looking at the Death March material, when you're talking about how this material got out to the civic level, I know that there are plenty of documents in the archive where there's lists of people who are survivors who are searching for relatives in other countries, and it says at the top of to be broadcast on this date. So there's obviously a radio list and things like that. It isn't quite the same, but if you're looking into how material was broadcast throughout Europe and communicated to the general public, there are some bits and pieces of information in the archive, but it's more sort of contextual. You have to read it on the documents. There's not like an overarching section. I think I'm right in saying that's about that sort of thing.
Yes, well, exactly like the help wanted statement I started with, which was an example of that sort of mass tracing. And you can find in the ITS archives posters and transcripts of radio broadcasts, for example, those sorts of examples of mass tracing, but they didn't include that sort of, they might have referred in general to forced evacuations and so on, but they didn't include the specific maps that they created.
And just to add one other layer, as you know, the way that inquiries to the ITS have been answered has evolved over time and changed over time. So you can actually look back in subunit 6 eventually. They've just made some of the initial inquiries available in subunit 6. So when you start to look online and you look in that archival inventory, some of the early ones are available, and you can see how sort of basic and rudimentary they are. But as time has gone on and the way that they've contextualized the information has grown. At some point, they were only issuing, with their answers, incarceration certificates of incarceration to prove that someone was in a particular place. And then, as you know, more recently, there's been more information provided in letters and documentation. So you can look at those. That whole section of the archive is called the tracing and documentation files. And those are something that they're continuously working on to make available online. But there's a lot of challenges with that because of GDPR, and the way that it works is that anytime someone's searched for, they are issued a number, so this TD number, and then on top of that inquiry, more information, you know, any other inquiries that have come sent in the last 70 years are put on top of that. So you can imagine if someone's searching within the last 5 years, they can't necessarily put that information online because it has personal email and addresses and things like that. And then just back to your question about whether the maps were made available, my sense is also, you know, I would agree with Dan, probably not. But if, for example, in the graves, the exhumations and graves recheck, if they had identified someone, I would assume that that would have been made available to someone if there was an inquiry. I mean, at least the notion that they were found, I think. I mean, I think we found examples of that when we were doing the exhibition. But as for the maps, my sense is probably not. Got 2 more questions coming in. Let's see. Can you search by document type just for photographic material? Elise or Mary, do you want to take that one? Oh, Mary, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm not a seasoned pro. Unfortunately, it's not set up in such a way, either with ITS in person or on this online resource that they have, that you can search for photographic information specifically. But if you're looking for a specific subject matter, just talk to whoever your assigned person is, and we might be able to help you find and direct you for what you're looking for.
Can I let me just show you one thing here. I'm just sharing my screen again. If you, there's a very limited, and I think this is something that they're working on. So again, just to be fair to the Arolsen Archives, it's a huge task that they're undertaking, and they're constantly improving it. So if you go to this section where Elise pointed out, and where I pointed out earlier, the topics, there is a physical characteristics part. Again, you can see that like digital image would be pretty much everything. So it only shows 68. So again, it's not quite there yet. But there is, I thought I saw photographs here, but maybe not. Never mind. But this is, I mean, I think at some point they will start to make this available, probably in this section. Maybe it was in, no. Yeah, no, not yet. But yeah, so if you're interested in seeing, the way that they evolve the category types of documents and the physical characteristics, my guess would be that any images it would probably be put in this section, so you can keep kind of track there. And I think we had another question from Carrie Ann. How consistent is the nationality filter? Does it connect to all sources related to the person if you find via nationality, or only to documents where the nationality is explicitly stated? So, ITS mavens, one of you, would you like to take that?
Yeah, I would say that at the moment, the nationality filter is not that consistent. So it wouldn't connect you automatically to the other sources related to that person. And as we showed earlier, unless the nationality may be recorded on the original document, but unless that has already been indexed, it won't link up the two. And also, there's obviously issues with nationality. Generally, I know when I've been doing research, one individual person's nationality changes throughout the course of their incarceration through various documents. So it's always a bit of a tricky one. But again, as Mary said, over the course of the next week, we are here to help. So if you want us to sort of have a little look around as well at our end and see what we can find out, we absolutely will do. I would say basically just sort of take a couple of hours tonight just to dig around the ITS in all of its manifestations as an exercise in patience. So it's quite meditative to try and sort of get into the right mindset, but we are here to help as much as we can.
Great. And we have another question from Bastian. Do you want to unmute, or would you prefer to put it in the chat?
I'll unmute. I hope you can all hear me.
Yeah, definitely.
Hey.
Hi.
It's a little bit of a cumbersome question because I haven't been able to really structure it, but I'm giving it a go. Given that there's like a moral component to these searches, or like a moral drive, and the logistical difficulties that there are, like, do you see like geographical differences in the thoroughness of the investigation? The reason that I ask is because I'm focusing on the Stutthof evacuation, which is obviously like in what would at that point be like Poland and Russia. So that is, yeah, that's the question, I guess.
Dan, do you want to take that one? Yeah.
Yeah. You do see differences, but of course, in the case of Stutthof, because the evacuation ends at the Baltic in Germany, there's actually a large amount of material in ITS relating to the evacuation. I mean, when I say large, I don't mean by ITS standards, but there is material there relating to the evacuation of Stutthof. So you'll find stuff, but in general, the investigations into the Death March investigations anyway are very thorough insofar as those took place into the interior of the Third Reich as it existed at the end of the war. So material relating to camps that were closed or liberated by the Red Army is much smaller than the material that's relating to camps that was captured by the Western Allies in April and May 1945. I mean, there are some exceptions. So Bergen-Belsen, the Nazis destroyed most of the documentation. So what's in ITS is quite limited. But material relating to, there's very little in ITS relating to the Reinhard camps, for example, or Chelmno. There is material relating to some of the concentration camps further east, like Vaivara or Kluge, and so on. But again, not very much. So where the investigations followed a route that was in Germany at the end of the war, you'll find a pretty substantial amount of material.
Okay, thank you.
I think we've actually gone over by 10 minutes, which is totally fine. But just wanted to make sure that there aren't any other last minute waves indicating questions. But it's also okay to ask us questions throughout the week. So it'd be great if we can welcome everyone back kind of same time, same place in a week's time. And then next week would be really, I think, interesting to hear about your own research and your own interests in the archive and what you found as you've taken some time this week to look through it. And as Elise and Mary have both said, we're absolutely here to help this week, so feel free to be in touch with us as you start to look. I'll send around the chat transcript so you have the URLs handy, and I think Elise is also going to send the PowerPoint that she put together, which also has kind of a step-by-step guide to researching. And there was a lot of interest in this workshop, and we tried to keep it small so that we have enough time to hear from everyone next week. But we are recording this and going to put it on YouTube. So thanking everyone who showed an interest in it and who unfortunately we couldn't accept for this one, but we're hoping to do these rather regularly and as we try out kind of different formats of making our information and our services available. So thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to my co-speakers. Thanks to Dan, Elise, and Mary. And thank you all for your participation, and have a wonderful and hopefully dry afternoon, because here in London it's kind of raining. So take care, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. It was fantastic. Well done.
Thank you, Ella. Thanks.